are here together on the same, here we are together on the same hangout, I think.
I'm
We're
here.
live. So we've had a little bit of a frazzling 20 minutes or 30 minutes maybe even since we've been trying to get this broadcast to go live.
It's
But
a great
welcome.
it's a great opportunity to practice emotional intelligence.
That's right. So let's see, what did we do to regulate emotion? You're laughing, and I'm not pulling out my hair, but
I don't have any left.
that was before you started the practice, eh?
That's right.
Well, welcome so much, and thank you for your patience as we've been working with tech. I love technology, but every once in a while it has a pretty big hiccup. So thank you so much for being here, for your patience, and of course, what you're doing in the world, what message that you're giving and what you're doing in the world. And let me introduce you to our guests. We had a wonderful hundreds and hundreds of people signing up to listen to you today, and I don't know how many are going to find us until after the fact, but it's great to have you here. So you are a leading expert on the application of emotional intelligence in the workplace, in relationships, to optimize performance. You are, what did you say, CEO at 6 Seconds?
Yeah.
CEO at 6 Seconds, which is a wonderful nonprofit organization that is spreading the word all over the world about leadership and motivation and using EQ, emotional intelligence, for motivation, for leadership, for improved performance, and mostly for having better relationships in the workplace as well as other places, I guess. So what do you want to say, Josh, about what you're doing right now, just in the way of introduction?
Well, I think, the point that we have emotions all the time, right? Whether we're dealing with a webinar or whether we're working with somebody in the office, it's emotions are part of what it is to be human. And those, I think a lot of times people, I can speak for myself, I have been uncomfortable with emotions and find them confusing and, in some way just like, can't we just push this aside? And I think that what's happening now, it's really exciting, is that increasingly people are saying, oh, actually, you know what, there's something valuable here. I could use these emotions. Let me understand them. They're here for a reason. Let me understand this and use this intentionally instead of just reacting.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think whether it's, connecting virtually like this or whether it's working in person in any sector, if we can get better at that piece of it, our lives become enriched and we become more effective.
We've become kind of more whole and complete as people, which helps us in so many places and everywhere in our life, really, I think, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that, tell me just a little bit about your story, your journey to emotional intelligence, because as you said in your introduction, you didn't used to think emotions were your friend, per se, right?
No.
So tell me a little bit about that journey and how emotions really have, like many men in our society, at least certain parts of emotion are not really acceptable or useful or seen,
Yeah.
limiting. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, I remember one of my first real jobs. I was doing construction, and I actually started a business when I was about 17, and I had a small team, and we were working on a project, and it was behind schedule and over budget. And one of my team members, we're in the car, and I'm frustrated, and this team member says, "Well, could we talk about this?" And I slammed my hand on the dashboard and said, "I don't want to talk about it. I just want the work to get done." So that's my starting point. And I'm working on it, Becca. I became a teacher, and I found that teaching is really a relational thing. It's not about facts, it's about people. I became a leader, and I found leading is not about facts, it's about people. And so I keep getting confronted with this in my life. I was really uncomfortable with emotions. I found them overwhelming, I found them confusing, I found them scary. I didn't like to ask people how they were feeling because, what if they told me? then what would I do? And so I kind of stumbled into this work. And now for 18 years, I've been doing this full time. And teaching about emotional intelligence, I've gotten to learn a little bit about it, and finding that emotions can really be a resource for me. And I think it's something that many people like you, it's like, duh, But some of us have taken a little longer to get there. So we teach people how to do that.
Yeah, so that's what your organization is about, is helping people make that shift to really value their own emotions, their inner world. Really, that's one of the ways I describe it, is what's going on in my inner world, and how can I use that to be, I think of whole and complete, but really emotions as a guide. So you talk about emotions as data, kind of data points, and maybe you can just describe a little bit, I guess maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because we're talking about the heart.
Yeah.
Some of the new research you have that you're helping people to learn about related to emotions in the heart. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, let's start with the data a little bit. We just published the State of the Heart report, and it's the first time we really have used a big data approach to understanding emotional intelligence. And we used a random sampling method to look at 75,000 people around the world and try to understand what's actually happening with emotional intelligence. And there are sort of two important pieces from that. One is emotional intelligence is in fact very important. Everywhere in the world we see this huge correlation. And I think I can show you a slide if we dare.
Yeah, I think we can. We might as well go for it.
So this is a correlation analysis, and you can see this beautiful, like textbook scatter graph where you see...
It looks like a feather, actually. It's so beautiful.
On the horizontal axis, you see emotional intelligence scores, and on the vertical axis, you see performance scores. And if you just think about like height and weight moving together, you can see emotional intelligence and performance scores moving together. And if you want to increase performance, what this is saying that something like 50 to 60% of the variation in performance is predicted by emotional intelligence, which, if you look at emotional intelligence as a tool set of learnable, measurable, scientifically grounded skills, say, wow, those are skills that are actually going to make a difference all over the world in a really robust way. So that's the good news.
That's such good news to know that 50 or 60%, and then to see that line just goes zoom straight up. With the more EQ someone has, the better their performance is. That's amazing.
So here's the bad news. It's not a massive trend, but over the 3 years of data we looked at in this analysis, emotional intelligence is going down.
That's terrible. That's just terrible. All the work that so many of us are doing.
I know. And I think we have tens of thousands of people in our network, and all of the people in your network, and all of these people trying to help us be smarter with emotions. And what it says to me is that the demand is rising faster than the supply.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
So
that's a great way to make sense out of that data. We think about, the first thing that comes to mind is what we're doing right now, which is we're sitting as virtually face-to-face, but we're not actually sitting face-to-face. And there's something that's really, and many people don't do that when they're doing digital things. They're not actually doing any real-time kind of connecting with people.
Yeah, and there's some research that says the more we're technologically connected, the less we're emotionally connected. Mm-hmm. There's some research that says the more time you spend on social media, the more lonely you are. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we have increasing complexity, we have increasing stress, and we have increasing isolation. And that's the tide that we need to work against. And I think that makes this work at this time imperative.
So repeat those things again.
Increasing stress
isolation,
and complexity.
and complexity. So all the things that we really need a tribe for, that we need connection about to help us buffer stress and complexity, we have less and less of.
Yeah, that's the real paradox, or I mean, maybe even crisis here, is that the very thing we need in order to handle that complexity, which would be connectedness, which would be sense of safety, ability to innovate and take risks and try things and get support and like, let's do things differently and let's think further ahead, it's harder and harder to do.
So knowing that, though, there are some ways that we're making some inroads, I guess, and one of the things that you're doing specifically with some of this data is helping leaders and helping workplace environments, I guess, where a lot of that stress and complexity hits. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think from a business perspective, we have to talk about increasing productivity, increasing profitability, increasing efficiency. That's the language of business, right? And that's the benchmark of, it's not that businesses exist to make money, but in some ways if the financial driver's not there, it's not a business. So
that's right, it would just be a hobby or an avocation or something. The thing that makes it a business is that you can make it profitable.
Yeah. And so we need to understand how, what are the constraints on bottom line performance, and what is going to facilitate or increase that bottom line performance. And I think what we're seeing is there's a need for innovation, there's a need for connection, there's a need for problem solving, there's a need for connecting with each other, there's a need for connecting across boundaries, there's a need for connecting with customers. I was talking to a very large tech company recently, and they were saying, we have these great engineers, and they're incredible at solving problems, but they don't really like customers. And they find it really difficult.
That's a big problem that they need some help solving.
Yeah, and another tech company. I mean, here in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of tech companies needing this. Another tech company was saying, look, we have these great tech managers, but we want them to become tech leaders. We want them to actually be able to work with their people and bring the talents to the table somehow. And there's a different skill set. And so, all right, well, what are the skills that are going to enable somebody to really lead people? What are the skills that are going to enable somebody to really connect with people? And by the way, we could talk about the same thing in the classroom, or we could talk about the same thing in a therapy office.
Well, I'm thinking about so many therapists, solo practitioners, or in a small group practice where much of the time, even though they're providing service that connects to people, they're not necessarily connecting to peers or to colleagues, and there's that different level of connecting that seems to be really important.
Yeah, and I think being able to quantify this so that, again, as if you're talking to business leaders in particular, being able to quantify it and say, look, let's understand this, let's put it on your dashboard, let's see how we can increase value by developing more capability. And so, whatever the result is, and whether, again, I think it applies in individual therapy too. We have this result we're looking for. What are the enabling kind of building blocks that are going to lead to this result? And can we measure those, and can we develop those? And I think that's the way to approach emotional intelligence.
Well, so that's a really interesting thing. I mean, you're talking to tech companies, for example. So I love technology myself and work a lot. If people would say I'm kind of a geek, or a nerd, and fortunately I have a lot of training so that I'm not just an introverted nerd, and I can connect with people. But that's a really interesting population where you're trying, as an example, where you're trying to get a particular message out, where it's very left brain oriented and not a lot of emotional intelligence. So if you can, kind of help the folks in that sphere really get a little more balanced, or in some way start to privilege their emotion, that's really good stuff. What are you doing to help that happen?
Again, the first step is quantifying it. If we can get data, it helps talk about it in that context. And then once the need is established with the data and helping people kind of really make the case and say, all right, we should work on this because it's going to help us get X, Y, and Z result. Then a combination of training, coaching. We really focus a lot on project-based learning. There's a great case study on our website about a project with Komatsu. And we didn't do training. We set up a process for them to say, look, let's understand this problem, and you guys come up with solutions, and we'll help you think about, different solutions and work on it and practice it. And we almost we hid the training inside a project. And what the HR director said, he saw that the way people were treated in the process, these are their managers, they started turning around treating their people in some of the same ways.
So there was some kind of inherent modeling that was happening that
so it's really a project-based.
It felt good to people.
They felt good to people. They felt this energy. They felt optimism. They felt possibility. But I think what's really key here is this kind of blending of IQ and EQ. Right? We need this sort of business logic, and to help make it make sense in that context, it has to be applied to our real challenges. And then we can kind of slip in a little neuroscience. We can slip in a little, you want people to work a little differently. Maybe you better understand a little bit about how people actually work. Let's talk about the brain for a few minutes. Okay, good. Now put that into your project plan. And we use a lot of, we really take a neuroscience approach because that helps make it credible in mainstream organizations, and people are fascinated about the brain. And emotions are neurohormones. They're electrochemical transmitters. And this brings us to the point about data. Emotions are, at a biological level, they're neutral. There's no such thing as good emotions or bad emotions. And by the way, they're completely, as Antonio Damasio says, they're enmeshed in the neural networks of reason. If you look inside the brain, what we call emotion and what we call rational thinking are completely mixed together. Right? So we have this juice that's some emotion and some cognition, and it's all together. And the degree to which the different parts of our brains are kind of working in sync with ourselves, that's how effective we are at processing information. And there's all kinds of information we need to process. We need to process information about how a system works or how a structure works, and we need to process information about how other people work and how we work ourselves.
So really kind of amplifying that idea that Dan Siegel talks about the neurointegration, how important that piece is to be able to use our whole brain.
Yeah. And to understand how you really work and how people really work, and use that.
So now in the workplace, you talk about, I've watched some of the things, read some of your stuff, and tried to make sure that of course, why I even invited you is because I was so excited about 6 seconds, and I've been part of the 6 seconds for over a year, and I just thought this is such a cool organization. But one of the things you say is something about creating feelings in the workplace, that we can be aware and we can create feelings. So do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting that artificial feelings are at a neurochemical level the same thing as real feelings. Right? If you and I just start laughing, for example, which I think would be kind of fun.
We do a little test together.
If we just start laughing, right, even if we don't really mean it.
If you laugh, I think I can follow you.
Okay.
And maybe we can get a bunch of people to join us.
Yeah, all the people watching, please laugh for a second. So even though nothing's actually funny going on here, except for, we're producing neurohormones that are affecting our whole physiology. Literally every cell in the human body is affected by these neurohormones. And that effect, that changes the way we're evaluating, the way we're responding. It changes what we're paying attention to. It changes how open we are to new ideas. So if you think about, from a business perspective, saying, I'm trying to create an environment where people can actually do great work.
Be productive, be creative, be happy. Yeah.
What do I want in that environment? And by the way, we ask the same thing in schools. Like, what is the context that makes a great place to learn?
And we know that we really have data that knows some of those things, like a safe environment, a warm environment, having connection, that when those things are optimized, that we perform better. So we know all of that already, yeah.
And we measure that in schools, we measure that in businesses, we measure it in nonprofits, and we can say, all right, let's actually map this context or climate of the organization, and then let's think about it's like this. How do we want it to be? And what are the skills that we need to change that?
Right. So you're able to bring it specifically, but when you are working to create feelings in the workplace, you also do some direct things about helping people to be aware or to do some regulation of themselves and others. You talked about something about, it trickling down from the leader down. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, and down and up and sideways. I mean, I think leaders have a very strong. Chip Conley, who wrote a book called Emotional Equations, he said, as the CEO, he's the thermostat of his organization. And I know if I'm in a meeting as a CEO, if I'm with my team, and I go in there and I'm caught up in the just struggles of running an organization, I can pretty quickly see how my team starts kind of sitting like this, whereas if I'm feeling connected myself with the vision and the potential and the great things that are happening, and I come into that room, just the way I walk into the room has an immediate effect. They're reading, and it's part of our survival, right? We're constantly reading emotional messages, and we don't have to be aware of it. We don't have to even believe in it. It's automatic, it's almost instantaneous, and it's continuous. These are signals about survival and opportunity. And our brains are constantly, and the whole structures in our brains are there. This whole mirror system is there to check that data and to see. So as a leader, I need to take responsibility for the emotional contagion effect. And that starts inside me. So if I'm going to take responsibility for how this is playing out in the organization, I need to start by being aware of myself. And I need to consider what is the impact that I want to have. And I think one of the most powerful tools for that is considering what's my purpose. Mm-hmm. And if I can align those three things that I just mentioned, that awareness, that intention in the moment, and that long-term purpose, then I can start having a really powerful effect.
Yeah. So let me give you a little scenario. See what happens.
All right,
so let's say, I'm in the workplace and somebody comes in to work and they got a traffic ticket on the way in and they're dysregulated, unhappy, concerned, and what does a leader do? What do you do in that sort of situation? Your colleague, your friend, somebody comes in, and if I'm just like light and joy with them, that doesn't necessarily help them shift.
Not going to be enough. So one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of organizational leaders are like me, in that I was really uncomfortable acknowledging emotion. Mm-hmm. Right? And I hear people say, well, I don't want to open Pandora's box.
Right. It's like
right?
what's in there. Once you open the feelings up, who knows what you're going to find?
And I also have had some. I was working with the casino, and the leaders are like, "We can't ask people about their feelings. It's not professional." Like, okay, probably there are limits, but at the same time, this person is interacting with your customers and your employees, and they're having an effect on the organization. And so you actually have a responsibility to pay attention to, maybe there's a personal boundary. There is, not maybe, there is a personal boundary, but at the same time, when they're in the workplace, what's going on with them emotionally is affecting the workplace. So one thing is just to acknowledge, hey, it looks like maybe you're having a difficult morning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, hey, how are you doing? And I think one of the things that really gets in the way is we're so used to saying, hey, Becca, how's it going? Oh, great. Okay. Like, look, we're done, right? I asked you how you were feeling. No.
Yeah, it's just a cursory pass by. There's
Yeah.
no real contact in that.
I had my son was in a school and he was miserable. Like, he was crying at night about, and it was like, he was really unhappy. And I said to the head of the school, look, I think he's not very happy. Can you check in with him? And he emails me back, says, yeah, I saw him in the hall today and asked him how he's doing. He said, great. Okay, maybe that's not the way to really have a quality interaction, right? So somehow we need to get a little bit past that just surface, pro forma interaction,
Mm-hmm.
and actually ask the question and make just a little bit of space. And by the way, we're sending emotional messages all the time. Like, I don't even need to ask somebody how they're feeling if I'm actually paying attention. And this isn't my biggest strength, but I've learned about this, and I can sit in a room and I can look around the room now and I can say, wow, that person is not smiling. I mean, just like, that may be obvious, right? But that person is not smiling. That person's shoulders look really tense. That person is frowning. Look, oh, there's data for me, right? I'm not talking about rocket science here. This is some really basic data. And I can look at that and I can say, okay, there's something for me to learn. As a leader, there's something I need to understand here. There's something going on. So just as I would ask inside myself, I'm feeling something. It doesn't mean that's good. It doesn't mean that's bad. Maybe it's right. Maybe it's not right. I don't know. But something's happening here. Right? And the bigger the emotion, the more it's happening. And if I can do that in myself, and I can do that with others and look around and go, oh, look, something's happening. Let me tune into that. Let me ask this person. Let me make a little bit of space to acknowledge what's going on for them. And often that is all it takes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that takes a certain kind of courage, really, to do that, doesn't it? It's a because you don't know. You could be opening Pandora's box.
Right.
Our brain is saying, "Oh, danger! Someone's distressed over there." It's not necessarily intuitive if we've been used to tuning out emotion to go towards that. That's not necessarily intuitive or easy to do.
I also think, I mean, for myself, again, I tend to take it personally. And I tend to be in, I'm the leader. So if somebody's unhappy, maybe it's my fault. Or maybe I'm conflict avoidant. Maybe they're mad at me. And well, if I ask them, then it's going to be this big thing. And, so I start making all these assumptions and start personalizing it and start, feeling defensive, really, instead of just treating it as something neutral. Oh, look, it's like when I'm working on a budget and the numbers don't come out the way I want it to. I don't get upset about that. I don't take it personally. It's not like, they're out to get, Excel's out to get me, Becca. It's just like, oh, okay, well, there's something going on. Why isn't this balancing? Right? I'm just treating it as a neutral thing.
Yeah.
And so I think the big message that I have for all of us about our own emotions, about other emotions, is if we can just kind of chill a little bit. It's like, it's just feelings.
Yeah,
It's
so
just,
that emotion as data idea that they're neutral, they're not good or bad. They're maybe some are harder, some are certainly
yeah,
more painful than others. Social rejection being one of those. That
yeah,
they're difficult, but they are there to tell us something. I guess
yeah,
that's the point. I mean, if it's data, the data can inform us about something.
yeah. And our willingness to have some chaos and some dissent and some challenge in our personal relationships, but certainly in our work relationships, our kind of tolerance for that is going to be a driving factor on our ability to actually innovate and actually solve problems. I remember I was facilitating 2 teams in an organization working on solving a particular problem, and the first team, it was so contentious. And given what I've told you, you can imagine my kind of internal reaction to this. But we got through it, and we finished this process, and we came up with a plan, and people were on board with it. This exact same kind of process in a second place in the same organization, and everyone's like, "Oh, okay, no biggie, whatever, that's fine." And it was like a 20-minute meeting instead of an hour-long meeting. I brought the 2 results to the senior executive team and said, "Okay, so here's what Team A said, here's what Team B said." And they were totally dissatisfied with Team B, the sort of pleasant team's response, because there was no, like, they hadn't thought through anything. They just went with this sort of surface solution. It was the dissent and the challenge that provoked the first team to really go more deeply and to think differently and to explore the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I think a lot of organizational leaders, a lot of us in our lives, we think dissent is sort of negative.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if we could say, look, it's a sign of life. My team is struggling. It means they're here. They're awake. They care. Right? Because if we don't care, we don't feel things.
Yeah, that's right. If we're not upset about it, that is a sign of caring. So there's a question here that Goldie says, what would you answer to someone who says, I can't get dragged down by my emotions. I'm too busy for that. I can't get stuck there.
I totally relate. What I would say is, some days, that's true. You're going to need to deal with it at some point. And if you are imagining that these emotional challenges are just going to go away on their own, you're fooling yourself. Mm. So a lot of managers say, I just don't have time for these people issues. I relate to that. There's some days where I'm like, look, we have a deadline. This has to get out the door today. I'm not going to think about anything else. But what I can promise you is that it's going to come up tomorrow if you don't deal with it today.
Mm. They don't just disappear.
And probably it's going to be a little harder to deal with tomorrow. And if you wait 2 weeks, it's going to be a little harder to deal with. And if you wait 2 months, it's going to be a little harder to deal with. So that's for your own feelings, that's for other people's feelings. So when somebody says, well, I'm too busy for this, okay, maybe you are too busy for it today, but recognize it's not going to go away on its own.
Yeah, we need to circle back to it. So now you have some really interesting research about some of gender and the way gender processes or manages emotion. And there's some strengths in each one, but maybe those are pretty cool slides. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you found about gender?
Yeah. So this was really surprising to me. So here's, again, from the same state-of-the-art research, this huge global data set. And what you see in pink are Ms. Average, and in blue, Mr. Average. And of course, we're dealing with averages here. It's not individuals. But when you look at the averages, you see males and females are opposite in their emotional intelligence strengths and weaknesses. And
so you'll have to help us with the legend.
Yeah. So Applying consequential thinking is the first one where there's a big gap, this ACT. And applying consequential thinking is about pausing to evaluate and responding instead of reacting. And so this is, for the males, their lowest score. So that would mean Mr. Average is much more impulsive, more reactive, not as likely to pause and think through the implications of his choices. Whereas Ms. Average, that's her biggest strength.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It's a big difference.
So an example of that might be?
So in the workplace, somebody says, okay, let's implement the blah, 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 and the Mr. Average says, good, let's go, I want on it, here's the first thing, blah, blah, blah. And Ms. Average says, wait a second, that's going to really upset our customers. Right? So she's looking at the consequences.
She kind of starts to look ahead. She can track ahead to what's going to happen.
Yeah. Whereas he's just going.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's strengths in being impulsive, but it can lead to a lot of emotional collateral damage. Emotional collateral damage.
Yeah, so there can be some real fast action and fast implementation, but there can also be some pretty big fallouts if that's not done in some sort of a balance, if there's not some forecasting, looking forward that way. Mm-hmm.
There's a really interesting case study on our website from FedEx, and the title of the case study is Faster or Better. And, you know, FedEx is an organization like so many organizations, which is speed and efficiency is absolutely a driver. But from a management perspective, is just going faster enough, or do we also need to be making sure that the choices we're making are really optimal from a people perspective? So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you've got to tell me what the average, what am I, as the average female, really so low at, that big dip there?
So that one is navigating emotions. NE is navigating emotions, and that it's related to emotional regulation or emotional management. But when we talk about navigating emotions, we're not just talking about controlling emotions. We're talking about harnessing emotions and using emotions as a source to move us forward. And so what that suggests is that Ms. Average is more likely to get stuck in whatever emotional state she's in. She's less likely to be have the emotional agility. Say, okay, I'm going to move in. You know, this is what I need to feel here. Let me move forward. Let me harness this emotion and kind of use it to move the boat.
So I might hang out in a particular emotion, especially tension or sadness or some sort of upset, and kind of get stuck there rather than shift out of it or use it as an energy to do something else with.
Yep. Whereas that's, you know, so that's the lowest score for Ms. Average, and it's the highest score for Mr. Average.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So again, really interesting complementarity. If we could get these two folks working together, we could really move.
And from an attachment perspective, when you're in relationship, a heterosexual couple, this kind of the average standard heterosexual couple, then when you have a female partner who needs some help shifting out of emotion and needs that contact from somebody kind of recognizing that state so she can shift, then you've got a partner seeing that tension and like going the other direction instead of going towards to help her move out of that.
Yeah, and it's almost a cliche, right? Of, you know, of he said, she said, and it's like, I don't want you to tell me the solution. I just want you to listen to me. And he's like, but let's move forward.
Right. Both can get stuck in their way of responding to that emotion, and one of them is to use it to move out, to kind of put in the survival, use the energy of the emotion to do something else, and the female often kind of gets stuck there.
Yeah, and again, this is, you know, averages. And
averages.
We know that individuals are different. But it's interesting to look at, this huge data set and think about what some of the trends are around the world.
Yeah, there was a couple other trends there that you had that showed some differences.
Yeah, let me go back to that slide. Here we go. So intrinsic motivation is the next one, where males are quite a bit higher than females. So that, that internal source of motivation, how do you fuel that fire within? And this is suggesting Ms. Average is more concerned, and again, it's almost a cliche, Ms. Average is more concerned with the opinion of others and needing others to be the source of motivation, where Mr. Average is a little bit more autonomous in his motivation. The next one is exercise optimism. Mr. Average is more optimistic, more likely to say, look, there's a solution, we can find a way out of this. It's not about, quote, positive thinking. It's not saying, oh, everything's fine. It's saying, look, this is crappy, but we'll find a way out. That's optimism.
Yeah. And this was a really big sample size that you used to, right?
Yeah. So we started with a sample of 75,000, and then we did a random sampling methodology within that 75,000 to create a balanced sample group. Balanced males and females, balanced in 3 regions of the world, balanced under 40 and over 40. So we could really look at, and balanced by career level, so that we could really make some comparisons. And Becca, this whole report is on 6seconds.org. People can just download the State of the Heart if they want to see this data and read more about it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource for people to be able to pull into. And then there's a little transposes again.
Yeah, empathy.
With empathy.
Yeah, increase empathy. And we say increase empathy, it's not just empathy for others, it's increasing the pool of empathy. Empathy for myself, empathy for others, creating that common space for feelings.
And that's really something that 6 Seconds and emotional intelligence also really privileges, is this idea of self-compassion as well. Because we can't know our own emotional states. We won't explore them if we don't apply some compassion around those emotional states.
Yes, and if we're in that place of judgment and blame and reactivity, it's very hard to reflect and see this as neutral data, because we're saying, oh, I shouldn't feel that, or I'm bad for feeling that, or I'm weak, or I'm strong, or whatever those judgments are. It's really hard to be in a learning place.
Yeah.
So curiosity, I think, is really linked to empathy.
Ah, I was thinking that exact same thing. Curiosity is so important if we're going to use emotions as data. Like, I'm feeling this, I wonder why that is. I can remember when I was first learning, about self-discovery and trying to understand myself and why I felt certain things, and learning about like critical self-criticism and inner dialogue and that sort of thing. And when I first started to apply curiosity to what I was feeling, it was such an empowering thing. I'd start to notice I used to have a lot of pain, tension, stress tension in my shoulders and I guess mostly in my shoulders. And I would notice that, and then I'd think, okay, I wonder, when did I start feeling that? Or what was I thinking when I started to feel that? What was I thinking just now? And it's amazing when you just kind of ask what happens. And my self-conversation would come up, and I could track it back 3 or 4 or 5 kind of internal critical kind of thoughts to that moment when it started to shift into tension. Like, oh, I was reviewing some conversation, or someone was asking something of me. There was something in work that maybe I thought it wasn't going to go well, and I'd have some judgmental or critical thought come up, and then all of a sudden there'd be this whole train of thoughts that were negative, and pretty soon I could feel it in my back.
So our thoughts, our feelings, and our physiology are linked.
Yep, so much so, aren't they?
Right, and I think it's not a linear process. Often it's described as thoughts create feelings, create actions, which is true. But it's also actions create feelings and thoughts create actions, and it's a dynamic process.
Yeah, and actually, if we look to how we perceive and how we get data in, that it will be the feelings that are the fastest, right?
Yeah,
so we really
dramatically
start by taking in data from the external or internal environment, and then that creates a feeling that then our thoughts are kind of trying to catch up to make sense out of.
So the emotion is kind of becomes like this meta filter through which we're seeing the world and we're interpreting the world. So I just want to say one thing about what you just said, Becca, which is we started this work in 1978. Our chairman published a curriculum for schools called Self-Science. And the whole message of self-science is to be a scientist about yourself.
It's just a great term, great terminology to talk about self-science. And you're so timely because there's a question in the chat box about applying this information to tweens or young adults and teens.
Yeah, absolutely. We have our people in our network working in schools and colleges and universities all over the world. And we're seeing a huge demand for it. There's I'll just give you an example. There's a program in Singapore. It's one of the large polytechnic schools there. And they're seeing that the young people in their program are experiencing those, those conditions we talked about at the beginning, stress, complexity, and isolation or loneliness, and that it's impairing their resilience. And so these young people are in this program and they're having trouble, Angela Duckworth talks about grit. They're having trouble, doing the work and sticking with it. And so this university is saying, all right, well, what are the skills these young people need in order to handle what they're facing? So I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, and I can see, it seems like every month that goes by, that their need for these skills goes up and up and up as they move into a more complex place in adolescence. And so the process is exactly the same, by the way, whether we're working with executives or whether we're working with 5-year-olds. Starting with that awareness, saying, okay, this is important. Let me see what I'm feeling. Let me become a self-scientist. Let me tune in. Let me be curious. And this 3-step process, being more aware, pausing to be more intentional, and then looking ahead to be more purposeful.
Yeah.
And do it again and again.
So that awareness is really important. And when you're working with teens or young adults, for example, or anyone who's really not been taught about emotions being okay, there's some great research around languaging feelings, and of course how we learn language is by being with other people and modeling and hearing other people. Right, so that's a really important thing, that you can sit down with your 13-year-old or your 11-year-old and you have a conversation with them about what they're feeling.
So I think normalizing feelings is something we've been talking about. We haven't used that term yet, but normalizing feelings, it's just part of being a person. Yeah. Whether we're talking about a 13-year-old or we're talking about a 37-year-old engineer, it's okay. Emotions are part of the story. Let's not get all dramatic about it. It's just okay. So you're sad. All right, that's interesting. Oh, so you're mad. All right, that's interesting. So normalizing it and talking about it. A little process that I like is we say take your emotions to the vet, validate, explore, and transform. And
nice.
The first step of validating is just saying, okay, that's real. Name it, acknowledge it, accept it. There's something valuable here. And then go to exploration. And I think normally most of us, especially us males, Mr. Average on our previous graph, we try to jump right into transform. And if we don't do the validate and then the explore, the transform is really difficult. But if we do the process in that order, validate, explore, and then transform, the transform is actually quite easy. So
yeah. The data, like with secure attachment or avoidant attachment styles and insecure anxious attachment styles, pairs into this so well. I was talking to a couple just last week, and the male partner said emotions just were not okay. So it scares me and I feel overwhelmed, you know. I just want to get away, fix it, do something, because it was never okay. And so when you sit down with your 13-year-old or your 11-year-old and you just listen, you validate and explore, you're sending a huge message that this is okay, it's safe, and it's fine, and it's normal. Not only are you teaching, you know, by modeling, but just the acceptance of your presence is huge.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think what happens is if we, Sue McNamara is our regional director for Asia Pacific, and she's just finishing her doctorate, and she did this really interesting study where she looked at the effect of adult emotional intelligence on children and students. And it'll be no surprise to you to find that when adults are actively practicing their emotional intelligence, the children's behaviors change.
That's huge. Right? That's
and
so
big.
When
you start inside and you say, okay, I'm gonna acknowledge what I'm feeling. I'm not going to be reactive. I'm going to be intentional, and I'm going to be more purposeful in the way that I'm giving my energy and attention to this young person. That in itself is transformational.
And that's really big. When you talk about, and I know we're getting close to time here, but when you're talking about actively practicing, you know, I might be a therapist and be very attentive to someone else's and walk out of the door and like think, well, when I do my meditation tomorrow morning, but that's not what you're talking about. You're not talking about like when we were meeting before going live. You said it's not active if you're just doing it like at yoga time or something, right? You're really talking about kind of breath in, breath out sort of activeness.
And the thing is that it's really a lot easier to do it just when you're on the yoga cushion or just when you're in the therapy office, right? It's what's hard is when it's hard.
Right.
And I know that, you know, that's sort of obvious, but it's like when I'm in this moment and I'm feeling myself reacting, which is usually with my kids or my spouse, and sometimes with my colleagues, but you know, when I'm in that place, that's when I most need to practice. And to say, oh, look, here's a little opportunity. I had a meeting yesterday, found myself starting to react. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Here's a little chance for me to practice.
Right. So first you started with kind of non-judgmental and maybe a little bit of curiosity, but like interesting, you know, that's a little
interesting.
Mm-hmm. Like a little curiousness in that. That's huge.
It's a huge change for me to see these challenges as not a negative thing, but as an opportunity.
So one of the things I think your organization provides so much that for anybody that is therapists that are on or just anyone that's watching, that 6 Seconds provides is so much free education around how to change feelings, how to validate. There's just it's a wealth of information that's going on all the time, and you have a conference that's coming up next month where a whole massive amount of new courses really are going to be provided. Can you tell us a little bit about the Vitality Conference and why this is your fourth conference? Why Vitality?
So we have about 80 webinars from all around the world, and we're aiming to have 30,000 people sign up for various webinars. And it's, as you know, it's a great way to connect with people. In the Vitality webinars, we have a lot of interaction, and we have a lot of chat and questions and polls and engagement with the participants. And we find that it's a way in that week itself, it's a way for us to practice, right? And it's a way for us to kind of blend head and heart. And we call it vitality because we're thinking about this idea of like, well, what really happens when we engage our emotions effectively? When we create this energy that is so needed in our organizations and our schools and our lives. So Vitality is all free, and it's the week of March 16th. And basically, all day long in North America, we have people presenting and participating and engaging in Vitality. And we also have people sharing resources every day. There's an email that goes out to 30,000 people with articles or tips or a handout or something to post on the fridge or an ebook. And by the way, if anybody is watching and wants to contribute to that gift bag on the Vitality website, there's a link to do that. We also have live meetups happening during Vitality, and again, there's a link to learn about that. So it's 6seconds.org/vitality.
Yep, I think people, hopefully they're seeing that in their sidebar. I'm not sure, but hopefully it is. It's beautiful. It's just an amazing amount. I've participated in your conference last year, and it was really great. The education that's going out there, and want to share it so far and wide to people, because if I can, as a therapist, if I can have other people doing, my clients working on that stuff in between sessions, working on their emotional intelligence, it's going to improve their lives, it's going to improve their relationships, and of course we know that helps transform the world as we go.
Yeah, and again, I think we're in this time and place where this is really needed. And maybe once upon a time, the kind of amount of emotional intelligence we learned just sort of naturally was enough. But what I would say is that today we absolutely have to make this a conscious, consistent effort. Given the way the world is, we need these skills.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for being on, for giving so much of your time, both in the setup and preparation through the technical downfall, and then here to really explain what you're doing and your study. That's fantastic. What good research that is. Just so appreciate everything that you're offering. It's been delightful to have you.
Thank you for all of your work sharing emotional intelligence and helping people learn these skills and share this info. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much. And I'll just mention that we have another talk time coming up next month, and it's going to be a fantastic topic also around emotion and neuroscience research. So you want to sign up if you haven't already to get those email alerts and notifications. So thanks for being here with us on Talk Time, Josh, and thanks to all of you for being here, and we'll see you again soon. Bye now.
Bye.